Imagine a world where one empire believed itself to be the center of the universe. Not out of arrogance, but because for centuries it truly was. In the early 1800s, Qing dynasty China stood unmatched, vast in land, ancient in wisdom, overflowing in wealth. Its emperors ruled over a civilization older than Rome, a nation whose culture, philosophy, and economy had survived dynasties, disasters, and foreign invasions. From the outside, it appeared invincible. Silk flowed from its looms, porcelain shimmered like polished moonlight. Tea leaves from the mountains of Fujian perfumed the globe. The West craved everything China had. But China? China craved nothing. British merchants offered clocks, wool, steel, and were politely dismissed. To the Qing court, these trinkets were the toys of a barbaric world. The Celestial Empire needed no one's goods, and certainly not the goods of a damp island on the edge of the world. It wasn't just pride, it was policy. Trade was tightly controlled, restricted to a single port in Canton, and even there under strict watch. Foreigners could not learn the language, could not set foot in the capital, and were banned from bringing their religion or politics with them. To China, Britain was just another tribute nation. To Britain, China was a wall, a colossal, immovable wall, standing between them and profit. And the British hated walls. Behind Parliament's gilded doors, in the smoke-filled offices of the East India Company, frustration brewed. How do you conquer a market that refuses to open? How do you penetrate an empire that believes your very existence is beneath notice? The answer was simple. You don't ask. You break the door down. And so, while the dragon rested peacefully on its mountain of treasures, the lion began to sharpen its claw. The silver bleed. It began with something as simple as a cup of tea. In drawing rooms across London, noble ladies sipped it with elegance. In factories, laborers drank it to stay awake through grueling shifts. By 1800, China's tea was no longer a luxury. It was an addiction. But there was a problem. China didn't want anything in return. So every chest of tea, every bale of silk, every porcelain plate had to be paid for in one thing: silver. And slowly, silently, the British Empire began to bleed. Vaults in London emptied. The East India Company's accounts dipped into crisis. Parliament trembled. Every cup of tea poured in Britain was draining the empire's veins. By 1816, the British were losing millions of pounds in silver annually to China. It wasn't just a trade imbalance. It was a slow-motion collapse of imperial dominance. And worse still, the Chinese refused to play by European rules. They demanded deference, not diplomacy, tribute, not partnership. The British response? They didn't change the rules. They decided to burn the rulebook. In the smoky corridors of Whitehall, a plan emerged, a quiet one, unofficial, deniable, and profitable. If China wouldn't trade, then China would be forced to. The empire needed a product that wouldn't just enter the market, it had to invade it. Something irresistible, addictive, and devastating. That product was opium. And so the British Crown, its financiers, and its merchants looked not east to China, but west, to India, to the poppy fields, to poison. Because the only thing more powerful than tea was the hunger that follows. The Crown's cartel. The plan was never debated in Parliament. There was no official vote, no public announcement. This wasn't policy, it was business. In the shadowy offices of the British East India Company, an empire within the empire, the decision was made. If China wouldn't buy from Britain, then Britain would sell what could not be refused. Opium. Harvested from blood-red poppies in Bengal, the drug was processed and packed under company supervision, neat bricks of slow death. It was not smuggled by criminals, it was trafficked by gentlemen, with titles and ledgers. At first, the shipments were small, enough to tempt, not overwhelm. But demand exploded, and the company saw it for what it truly was, a gold mine. By the 1820s, the British East India Company had become the largest narco syndicate in world history, operating with military backing, royal approval, and financial cover from the Crown itself. They didn't just sell opium, they engineered an entire pipeline. Grown in India under company rule, auctioned off to private British merchants, smuggled into China through corrupt ports and underpaid officials, pushed into a population never prepared for a drug so devastating. This wasn't a back alley operation. It was a state-backed addiction industry. And all the while, the profits flowed back to London, through banks, into aristocratic estates, even funding political campaigns. And what did the British call this silent war of narcotics? Free trade. But for China, this was not trade. It was invasion. Not with soldiers, but with smoke. Not with cannons, but with a craving. And while the dragon still slumbered, its bloodstream was already turning black. The poisoned empire. It didn't look like a war. No cannons, no uniforms, just a small, smoky pipe passed from hand to trembling hand. But make no mistake, this was an invasion, atomized into every breath. In the tea houses of Canton, in the brothels of Beijing, in the quiet homes of forgotten villages, opium crept in like a ghost. Not with screams, but with sighs. At first, the wealthy indulged, calling it medicinal, even refined. But soon, the craving spread, from scholars, to soldiers, to street sweepers, and then to their children. China, once proud and self-sufficient, began to rot from the inside. The statistics were damning. Over 10 million users, an entire generation slipping into addiction, their muscles limp, their wills shattered, their minds clouded. And while the people suffered, the corruption metastasized. Customs officers were bribed. Port officials turned blind eyes. Local governors took their cut, bought silence, and lit their own pipes. Even the emperor's court was not immune. There were whispers that nobles were using in secret, that policy was being written by men too numb to care. The backbone of the Qing dynasty, the Confucian order, the imperial bureaucracy was crumbling, not from rebellion, but from dependency. And in London, there was no remorse, just ledgers, charts, profits rising, measured in silver, not souls. They called it commerce. They claimed it was voluntary, but this was not trade. It was chemical warfare disguised as business. A drug epidemic manufactured on purpose by an empire in waistcoats and wigs, drowning a civilization in addiction, just to balance the books. The dragon was still breathing, but now it was wheezing, and the empire that once wanted nothing now needed something it could never escape. The man who burned the drugs. The Qing Empire was unraveling. Cities drowned in smoke. Soldiers abandoned posts for one more hit. Sons stole from their parents. Daughters were sold to buy another pipe. And at the palace gates, silence, bought, bribed, or broken. But then, one man refused to be silent. Lin Zexu. Scholar, reformer, loyal to the emperor, but more loyal to China itself. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a rebel, but he had the one thing the empire had run out of: conviction. When the court assigned him to Canton, they expected paperwork, maybe polite letters. Instead, they got a firestorm. Lin moved like a scalpel through corruption. He arrested dealers. He humiliated officials. He seized over 20,000 chests of opium, not to sell, not to store, but to destroy. On the banks of Humen, with crowds watching and merchants begging, Lin ordered it all dumped into the sea. 1.2 million kilograms of British narcotics, gone. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate, because to him, this wasn't trade. This was a national disease, and he was the cure. His letter to Queen Victoria was sharp, respectful, but unyielding. "What right have you to poison my people while hiding behind trade and civility?" There was no reply, only ships. Because while Lin Zexu thought he was saving China, Britain saw a threat to profits. Lin had touched the third rail, not of politics, but economics. He had dared to destroy merchandise that funded aristocrats, bankers, and boardrooms in London. So they sent their answer in gunmetal, cannons, frigates, iron. And as the British fleet gathered, Lin stood alone, not just against an empire, but against the future. He had lit a fuse. The war hadn't started yet, but the powder was dry. And Britain, masked in civilization, was about to show how far it would go to defend its drug trade. The gunboat dealers. The British didn't weep over the opium. They didn't mourn the merchants. They didn't care about Lin Zexu's convictions. They saw one thing: property destroyed. And in the empire of profits, that was grounds for war. Behind closed doors in London, Parliament debated treaties. But behind those doors, in lavish clubs and counting houses, merchants sharpened their knives. The East India Company, the banking elites, the opium kings of Bengal, they whispered to the crown, "This isn't about drugs. It's about honor, trade, sovereignty." But everyone knew it was about revenge and profit margins. So they sent the gunboats, not an army, not a warning, a floating wall of iron and empire. In 1839, British warships arrived off the Chinese coast like silent predators. No formal declaration, no diplomacy. They shelled ports, they bombarded forts, they slaughtered fishermen. The Qing Navy, centuries behind, stood no chance. Junks of wood and courage met cannons of steel and greed. The battle wasn't fair. It wasn't supposed to be. This wasn't a war between equals. It was a demonstration of what happened when you disrespected the crown's cartel. And as British Marines marched ashore, seizing cities and rivers alike, the message rang clear: you will take our goods, or we will take your land. China had tried to block the drug, so Britain would break the country. What began as a trade dispute now became something darker, a war not over opium, but over the right to poison. And the West would call it civilization. The Treaty of Shame. The cannons stopped. The smoke cleared. But for China, the real wounds were just beginning. They called it a treaty, but treaties imply choice. This was a terms of surrender written at gunpoint. In 1842, aboard a British warship floating off the coast of Nanking, China signed its name under threat of annihilation. No negotiation, no mercy. The Treaty of Nanking was more than paper. It was a weapon dressed in ink. First, they took Hong Kong, a jewel ripped from the Chinese coast. Then 5 ports were opened to British traders and to British warships. Tariffs were fixed, silver would flow, and opium, still illegal in name, but now protected in silence. But the most devastating clause? Most favored nation. A poison pill hidden behind polite words, guaranteeing that any rights given to another Western power must also be given to Britain. A backdoor, a leash, a permanent key to China's locked gates. And what did China get? Nothing, not even dignity. As British officials toasted their victory with imported wine, the emperor wept in private. He had lost a war, but worse, he had lost face. In Chinese culture, pride is sacred. Legacy is eternal. And now that legacy was fractured, not by soldiers, but by signatures. The people called it what it was. The century of humiliation had begun. It wouldn't be the last treaty, and it wouldn't be the last shame, because once the door was open, the West would keep pushing. And China would keep bleeding, ink, silver, and sovereignty. The silence before the second storm. The treaty was signed. The war was over. But in China's streets, in its ports, in the veins of its people, the poison still flowed. British merchants returned not as guests, but as kings. They walked freely through Chinese cities, demanded special treatment, and set up foreign enclaves, tiny slices of Europe carved right into the heart of the Middle Kingdom. They brought with them more than just opium. They brought missionaries, men in robes who preached about salvation, but walked in the shadow of the gunboats. Their crosses came with contracts. Their sermons carried imperial undertones. And the opium, it didn't just continue, it surged. Despite the ban, despite the shame, British traders found ways to push it harder, bribing officials, corrupting local elites, and expanding their underground network. China's own bureaucracy began to rot from the inside. And in every home where a pipe was lit, in every alley where a man collapsed, in every family torn apart by addiction, the humiliation deepened. The emperor tried to restore order, new reforms, new officials, new rules. But it was like patching a sinking ship with silk. The West wasn't done. They wanted more ports, more access, more control. But they didn't want to ask. They wanted a reason. So in London's smoky rooms and Paris's golden halls, plans were whispered. All they needed was a spark, an incident, a staged insult, a pretext. Peace was an illusion, a thin curtain fluttering before a storm, because Britain wasn't finished breaking China, not by a long shot. And what came next would be worse than anyone could imagine. The False Flag War. It started with a ship, Manning saved Justin. A small Chinese crew boarded a British flag vessel, the Arrow, on suspicion of piracy. No one was killed, no shots were fired, but to the British Empire, this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was an opportunity. In truth, the Arrow wasn't even flying a British flag legally anymore. Its registry had expired, but that didn't matter. Lord Palmerston, Britain's Prime Minister, took the incident and turned it into outrage. Newspapers frothed with fury. Insult to the crown, attack on free trade. The drumbeat of war began again. But this time, they weren't coming alone. France joined in under the pretext of protecting its missionary interests. One French priest had been executed in China, and like the Arrow, his death became convenient fuel for invasion. Two great European empires, cloaked in moral outrage, marched toward China not for justice, but for expansion. They didn't want negotiation. They wanted new treaties. They wanted legal opium, more ports, embassies in Beijing, and a message carved in steel: China will obey. Once again, gunboats sailed. Once again, cities fell. Once again, the Dragon's pride was trampled under boots bearing the Union Jack and the fleur-de-lis. The Second Opium War had begun, not over truth, but over a fabricated insult, Manning saved justice, and a buried agenda. It wasn't justice, it was theater. The false flag worked, and as war engulfed China once more, the West prepared to deliver its cruelest message yet. The day the palace burned. It was called Yuanming Yuan, the Garden of Perfect Brightness. A sprawling palace of jade bridges, bronze lions, and silk-covered halls, filled with scrolls, relics, and millennia of memory. It was not a fortress. It had no army, no cannons, just culture. And in 1860, it burned. British and French forces, victorious in the Second Opium War, had marched on Beijing. Their demand: access, trade, and total submission. But when Chinese envoys tried to negotiate, they were seized, tortured, killed. The West claimed outrage, but their response wasn't justice. It was revenge, raw, theatrical, and unforgettable. They didn't target soldiers. They didn't burn barracks. They burned beauty. Lord Elgin, the British High Commissioner, ordered it personally. Let it be a lesson. And so they set fire to history. For days, the sky over Beijing glowed orange. Pagodas collapsed into ash. Libraries turned to smoke. Masterpieces gone. Silks unraveled. Jades shattered. Even the emperor wept. It was not a battle. It was a ritual humiliation. A funeral pyre for the Chinese soul. Thousands of stolen artifacts made their way into European museums. The West called them souvenirs. China called them scars. This wasn't just about opium anymore. This was about owning the past, erasing pride, replacing memory with silence. And it worked for generations. But deep in the ashes of the summer palace, something else smoldered. Resentment. Not dead, just waiting. Because they didn't just burn a building. They burned a civilization's heart. And the dragon never forgets. The puppet sovereignty. The emperor's throne remained, but it was a throne of shadows. After the treaties and the fires, China was left with an emperor who ruled in name alone. Foreign flags flew over its ports, foreign soldiers patrolled its streets, foreign merchants dictated its economy. Opium was no longer just smuggled, it was legalized, controlled, and taxed. An empire once proud was now shackled by law to its own addiction. The Forbidden City's walls echoed with hollow commands. Ministers whispered pleas to foreign diplomats. Policies were written by others, by British consuls and French envoys. China's sovereignty was a fragile illusion. Cities like Shanghai and Guangzhou became foreign concessions, enclaves of Western power, law, and culture within Chinese soil. And in the countryside, the people suffered, addicted, impoverished, and forgotten. The empire's bureaucracy groaned under foreign influence, its Confucian ideals undermined by corruption and despair. The Qing dynasty survived, but only as a puppet on strings pulled by London and Paris. What was once the Middle Kingdom was now a colony within its own borders, a nation humiliated. And beneath the surface, a simmering anger began to build. Because a kingdom without power is a kingdom on the edge of revolution. The bankers behind the bombs. Wars don't pay for themselves, and empires don't expand on goodwill. Behind every British gunboat that thundered against China's coast, behind every cannonball that shattered a Chinese fort, were men in smoke-filled rooms counting their profits. The aristocrats in London's clubs, the bankers whose ledgers read in millions, the shareholders of the British East India Company. They were the real architects of empire. Their greed didn't wear uniforms. It wore waistcoats and wielded pens. Money was lent. Ships were insured. Contracts were drawn. And debts collected with bullets and treaties. The opium trade was a perfect storm of capitalism and cruelty. It filled pockets from Calcutta to Westminster, from the tea rooms of London to the docks of Canton. Behind the glory of gunboats and generals lay a darker truth, a vast financial machine, profiting from addiction, humiliation, and war. As the Chinese people fought, starved, and died, bankers toasted their gains with port wine. Because the true power of the British Empire wasn't its armies, it was its ability to turn suffering into silver. And as the smoke settled over China, the real victors watched their dividends rise. Proof that in this war, money was the deadliest weapon of all. The longest wound. The guns finally fell silent. But the echoes of the Opium Wars did not fade. China was broken, not just in land or sovereignty, but in spirit. Generations grew up under foreign boots, their lives shadowed by addiction, poverty, and shame. Families torn apart, villages emptied, the emperor's court a hollow shell. The Qing dynasty struggled to hold together a kingdom unraveling at the seams. Rebellions flared, some sparked by starvation, others by the unbearable weight of foreign domination. The Taiping Rebellion, one of the bloodiest civil wars in history, was fueled in part by the despair unleashed by these dark times. Foreign soldiers patrolled streets like conquerors. Missionaries preached, trying to replace ancient beliefs with foreign gods. China's rich culture was under siege, and the addiction? It was a poison that flowed like a river, unrelenting. Opium dens multiplied, health declined, the economy faltered, and hope grew thin. The century of humiliation stretched on, a wound that bled decades. But even in the darkest nights, a fire burned in the hearts of many. A fire of remembrance, of pride, of rebellion, because a nation scarred so deeply would never truly die. The empire that remembered. The world thought China was broken beyond repair, an empire humbled, shackled by foreign guns and foreign laws. But beneath the ash and rubble, something was stirring. A quiet determination, a fierce memory. The Opium Wars had scarred a generation, but they had also etched lessons into the soul of a nation. From the rubble of humiliation rose reformers, revolutionaries, and visionaries. Men and women who refused to forget. China watched, recorded, learned. Every handshake with a Western diplomat, every treaty signed under duress, every foreign soldier marching through its streets, it all became fuel. The old dragon, once humiliated, addicted, and oppressed, was preparing to rise, not just as a survivor, but as a power reborn. Because history is never just about the past. It's about how the past shapes the future. And China's future would be forged in the fires of remembrance. The ghost in every handshake. Centuries have passed. The empires of old have faded, but the ghosts remain. In every negotiation room, in every trade deal signed, in every handshake across the table, lurks the memory of the Opium Wars. Modern China walks with pride and power, but beneath the surface, history lingers. Every demand for respect, every assertion of sovereignty, is shaped by centuries of being broken and rebuilt. No nation forgets a century it spent addicted by force. No empire escapes the weight of its past. The wounds of the Opium Wars are not buried in textbooks or museums. They live raw and burning in the heart of a rising China. And that ghost, it will never stop watching, because history is never silent, and neither is memory.